I wanted to ask you regarding what to make of the miraculous existence and success of modern day Israel. The Haredi argument against Zionism versus the argument for post-facto religious Zionism. We wanted to get your thoughts on this topic that seems to be a very loaded topic, especially in these days.
Well, first of all, obviously, it's not my place to disparage or demean or to criticize the different positions of Gedolei Israel. I can just tell you my particular shita, my particular approach, and I cannot claim that I'm more right than anybody else. And that is, in Klal Yisrael, there are basically three approaches towards the state of Israel. There is the extreme, the Turei Karta, Satmar, Toldos Aaron approach, in which the very creation of a state is against Hashem's will until the coming of the Mashiach. And they have textual support for this in Maseches Kesubos, the three oaths that the Jewish people made. And they claim that the problem of the state is not its irreligious nature or its secular nature, even if you have the Chafetz Chaim as the Rosh HaMemshalah. It would be absolutely forbidden to have a state. It is a miridah, kineged malchut shamayim, as the Turei Karta signs say on Yom Ha'atzmaut and other times. So that's one extreme. Now, I do want to point out that although today we consider that to be kind of a minority position, you would be very surprised, perhaps, to learn that prior to 1948, it was, if not necessarily the mainstream position, it actually was a mainstream position. As great an authority as Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch actually took that position in the 19th century. Very surprising.
I didn't know. Can I actually ask a question on that before you get to the next two? Yeah. Because I want to say on this topic, the position of the Kharidiv or the Satmars, let's say, do you think their position would have been different had they known about the Holocaust happening? Because a lot of them, obviously, they perished in the people who took this position perished in the Shoah, and if they knew what modern day Israel would be, then and what the Holocaust was, they arguably would have changed their mind.
I think we actually have a test case that may support your argument, and that is Rabbi Yitzchak Dov Teichsel, who was a Hungarian Rav, a very chashuv Talmud Chacham, and he was a Munkacher Chassid, which is even more to the right of Satmar in terms of their anti-Zionism. So he was an extreme anti-Zionist, anti-Mediniot. But as he suffered in the Holocaust, and he eventually died in the concentration camps, he came to a radically different conclusion about the gift of Eretz Yisrael, the need to save the Jewish people, and the need to have Avat Yisrael. And he wrote one of the great classic books. He's called the Hungarian Rav Kook, Eim Habanim Smecha, which has been translated into English as well. And essentially, although he was not as poetic and as mystical as Rav Kook, so he didn't draw on the same sources, but it's a very erudite and passionate book about the need to settle Eretz Yisrael and how our connection to Eretz Yisrael brings Rachamim into the world. So we do have at least one example of a radical anti-Zionist essentially becoming a committed Zionist, even with working with non-religious people, as a result of his understanding of the Holocaust. Now, you can't prove anything from one person, and after all, the Satmar Rav himself, suffered during the Holocaust, etc., and did not change his position. So, with respect, however, to the non-Satmar elements, I think you're right. I think that the reason why the mainstream Torah world did not stay with the Turei Karta Shita, the mainstream Torah world, might be very well much because of the Holocaust and what that meant for Jewish survival. Now, the second view, which is a polar opposite, one is it's forbidden to have a state. The other view is that the state is Reishit Tzmichat Ulatenu, as the prayer says, in which it's a harbinger of redemption and it's part of a messianic process. This was often associated with the Talmidim of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, Rav Kook's only son, although Rav Kook himself did not necessarily, Rav Kook Sr. did not necessarily speak of, there was no Medina in his day, but of a potential Medina in that way. But certainly the Talmidim of Rav Tzvi Yehuda were messianic. Many of them were in their vision. And that had political repercussions. So, for example, they could not imagine any type of territorial concession because how could you go backwards in the messianic process? And that's kind of an extreme view, the opposite of the Turei Karta. But I think that there is a middle of the road view in which we don't necessarily ascribe a messianic significance to the state of Israel, but we look at it as a chesed that God gave us in the aftermath of the Shoah to allow the Jewish people to return after almost 2,000 years to their country, to have a measure of self-government. I do want to point out halakhically, just purely halakhically, without messianic overtones. It seems to me that when the Ramban defines the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Israel, he includes in that mitzvah not just living in Israel, but the establishment of Jewish sovereignty as a component of that mitzvah. According to the Ramban, I would actually argue establishing a Jewish state is not only permitted and desirable, it is actually considered to be part of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Israel. People make a big mistake. They assume the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Israel only refers to residence. I believe in the Ramban, I think you'll clearly see that it includes sovereignty. I mean, that's a halachic point that one should take into mind. But even without the halachic point, I think that most of us understand that there's something miraculous here about the Jewish people being able to return to our lands and to build up a society that, number one, economically is a wonderful society, a startup nation. And the fact that with all of our quibbles and all of our arguments against the Medina, and of course I have many, many issues that I take issue with, it is a supporter of Torah, it is a haven for Jews from all over the world. You know, I have a tremendous amount of hakarat hatov to the army, to the police, really to the whole government, for creating an infrastructure in which Jews can come, they can flourish, and Torah can be learned, and Torah can be taught, and Torah can be observed in a way that is unparalleled anywhere else in the world. So my middle of the road position is that I may not necessarily ascribe to the state a messianic overtone, but I do believe it was really a gift that God gave a battered and devastated people after the destruction of the Holocaust. And in fact, something that confuses me is that the Brisker Rav, who was known as an anti-Zionist and anti-Medina, is quoted in 1948 as saying that Medinat Yisrael was a smile that God gave us after the darkness of the Holocaust. I honestly do not know to this day how to reconcile that with his anti-Zionist position, but I believe the quote is documented that he actually said that. So I think Yom Ha'atzmaut is a day that's worthy of celebration. Now, whether you say Hallel or not, from a halakhic perspective, it probably is not a day that would have Hallel with a bracha. But again, those are technical halakhas. I don't think that they need to be ideological fights about this. But I think it's something to be very, very grateful for. And hakarat hatov is a very big yesod. In fact, I just want to add, I live in Israel. I've been living in Israel for 12 years now. And one of the things that's most disheartening is the polarization, not only between religious and secular, but all the different grades of religious, Hasidim, Misnagdim, within Misnagdim, within Hasidim, Datim, Yomi, Haredi. We cut it and slice it and dice it in 1 million different varieties in ways that Americans couldn't even perceive the differences, but the differences are here. But I always think to myself of a verse in Mishlei, Kamayim apanim al panim came adam li'adam. As water reflects the face that you show it, so as the heart of man reflects. I look into the water with a smiling face, I get back a smile. So I show you love and respect, you will love and respect me. It seems to me that if we could learn to love and respect the contributions of every segment of Klal Yisrael, the police, the firemen, the government, the infrastructure, I believe that the Chiloni side would have greater respect and love for Torah observant Jews as well. It's kind of a vicious circle. I look down at the Chilonim and I say they're Amalek or whatever rhetoric a person uses, they're going to look at me and say parasite. And if we could break that vicious cycle with respect and genuine admiration for the good that people are doing, I think they would see the good in the Torah camp. And of course, there is tremendous good.
For sure. And as Sephardi Jews, we don't see that much division in that sense. Like, we pray in a shul where there's a guy with a black hat in our row, and then there's a guy who drives to shul. Yeah. Like so we're with you on that. We totally agree. And I once heard something nice. Someone said Tzibur is a tzaddik, Benoni, Rasha. We're all together.
No, you are correct. I do know that Sephardim, you never had organized movements against Yiddishkeit. You had many individuals who were not religious necessarily in terms of their private observance, but the Beit Knesset was always kahalacha. Everybody davened in the shul together. There was no conservative reform movement. You didn't have schisms. And again, I don't want to, I'm not a Navi, and I know that in your demystified podcast, you don't want to get into mystical ideas, but some have said, some have suggested, and I can only say this as a speculation, that perhaps the Sephardim suffered a bit less in the Holocaust, precisely because in the zechut of not having this pirud and this sinat chinam that existed among Ashkenazi Jewry.
So I want to stay on this specific thing on what you mentioned before about unparalleled, Israel being unparalleled. To me, I look at, we read Tanakh, and I look at the ideal, which is Malchut Israel, which is having a kingdom in Israel, and I see kind of a failed experiment. God warned against it, and it didn't really work out. And then we look at modern day Israel, and we see that it's kind of a success story, and it's been going on for over 70 years. So in a way, it's kind of outdone the vision of what the Torah had in mind for us, right? It's kind of exceeded expectations because it's been such a success story. Obviously, it's not perfect, like nothing is, but that's one argument I would make to say, like, hey, look, this is something that obviously Hashem is behind us.
When Abraham Lincoln was fighting the Civil War, so his cabinet told him, Mr. President, we will succeed because God is on our side. And he said, it's much more important that we be on the side of God than God be on our side. Yep. And, that's something to think about. Baruch Hashem, God has given us much to be grateful for. But that does create a responsibility on our part to build a just society, a moral society, a society of values. Now, I think Israel has definitely moved in that direction. That's why it is so. And again, I'm even referring to the secular part of the state, the fact that Israel is a first responder all over the world. Whenever anybody is in need, the Jewish instinct of chesed and rachamim comes out. We gave aid and refuge to Syrians who were willing to destroy us, and if I give them 5 minutes. If you're a terrorist and you're treated in an Israeli hospital, you will get good medical care. Which, if God forbid the opposite situation would ever happen, the Jew would not come out of the hospital alive. So there's a lot to be proud of. Again, even from the secular standpoint, I consider the IDF to be the most moral army in the world, in which they literally put themselves at risk going from door to door to look for terrorists when they risk being killed instead of aerial bombings, which create a lot of collateral damage. And they try to avoid that.
It's really incredible when you think about it, like what the army has to go through. It's like trying to protect, trying to protect the innocence of your enemies while fighting your enemies. Like, it's unheard of.
And all of this notice they give, the leaflets, and they kind of notify the terrorists ahead of time, hey, we're going to be bombing here. But maybe the decisions are not militarily correct, but morally, I get a great deal of pride. I see the Yiddish neshama. I see the Jewish sense of rachamim coming out, and that makes me very proud. But there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do. We can't be complacent about this. Right. And as I say, God has been good to us, but we have to be good to God as well.
But if I were to have a conversation with a Satmar, let's say, I don't get the opportunity so often, unfortunately, but I would want to kind of have an understanding of, okay, so they understand the three oaths and we don't, and they follow the Gedolim, but I want to understand, logistically speaking, how would the messianic process or the rebuilding of Israel occur from their point of view? How would that actually happen? Is it like a Mashiach flying, on a chariot from heaven, and the temple just dropping onto the, to the spot that it was in?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one version. I mean, Rashi says in Masechet Shavuos that the third mikdash will come down min hashamayim, etc. The Rambam says Mashiach will build the third base on mikdash. But the assumption is, however Mashiach will reveal himself, maybe it'll be miraculously, maybe not. But at that point, we then proclaim independence, and the world will acknowledge it, because the world will acknowledge the Mashiach. And then we will do everything with the haskama of the Umot HaOlam in that sense. Now, of course, there is a famous quote from the Chafetz Chaim, and again, I'm not sure if it's 100% verified, that when the Balfour Declaration was issued, was it 1917 or 1918? The Chafetz Chaim was very, very happy. He said, now the oath has been annulled, because the establishment of a Jewish presence in Eretz Israel would be with the agreement of the ruling nations, and it would not be a merida. So it's interesting that he saw the Balfour Declaration as absolving us of whatever restriction the oath carried.
Well, the thing that, to me, like they'll say they're waiting for Eliyahu Navi or a prophet to kind of reveal that this is the messianic age, or this is the process. To me, when you read Devarim and it talks about the end of days, the ingathering of the exiles and all that, we could see the prophecy has already come true in a sense. So there's no need for that. And also these kind of miraculous, over the top, supernatural, events that they're waiting for, that never really happened to begin with. Like, even when they conquered Israel, they used military strategy, and they went into Jericho, and they were preparing as if they were fighting an actual, war, not expecting God to do anything. So I don't know how that changes.
There was miracles, but there was a balance. Right. But there was balance. There was full hishtadlut involved. And then,
I mean that's really, again, I think you're restating one of the objections. And again, I say this with total respect. I don't want to denigrate anyone, but this is one of the objections to the Satmar position, and that is, Satmar's position is basically, it was God's decree that we're in Galut, so we have to await God to take us out of Galut. Now the argument is, you never use Emunah to dispense with hishtadlut. I mean, a person doesn't say, for example, my parnasa comes from God, so I'm not supposed to go to work. Or you don't say, my health comes from God, so I'm not supposed to seek medical attention. Obviously, that would be very, very foolish. So to say that because God put me in galut, I'm not allowed to do anything to take me out of the galut, would be the same logic that would say, I don't have to go to a doctor because God will give me refuah, or I don't have to work because God will give me parnasah. Now, if on the micro level, a Satmar will go to work, and indeed they have a tradition, they don't send people to Kotel, but they go to work, or I go to a doctor, then why on the macro level is establishing a Jewish independence from the Golah considered to be so bad? So, I mean, that's kind of an inconsistency in the argument there. I agree with you. Now, of course, the non-religious nature of the state is a separate issue. That's not
totally separate
parcel, but there's no question that a lot of the fuel that fueled the Neturei character position was also the anti-religious stance of early Zionists. But you're correct. Their theoretical structure does not rest on that.
Thank you. That was really
Thank you very much.
So now we want to touch on a subject